It's tough times for video game developers these days. They are constantly being asked to give the player what they want and to actually make a product or something. It's a hard thing for the industry to fulfill, but nevertheless, here we are at long last. And Paradox is no exception. Paradox has not been doing particularly well recently, largely because they have, after having built up a tremendous amount of goodwill over the course of years and years, mostly managed to squander the majority of it. And so now, as they are probably building up for a big new title, likely the next Europa Universalis, they are trying to regain some of that goodwill by engaging in what I like to call the Peter Molyneux strategy. Now, some of you, I hope, might remember that name, Peter Molyneux, creator of games such as Black and White or Fable. He had a rather recognizable strategy. He would promise the world, the sky, space, and catgirl waifus aplenty, and then he would deliver half to a third of it. Don't get me wrong, his games were usually pretty solid. Black and White 1 was awesome, Black and White 2 was okay, even if it was nowhere even remotely close to finished, and Fable as well. I still quite enjoy Fable 1, even if the latter entries were not particularly stellar. And then after the release of the game, and it became apparent that he had lied a lot, Peter Molyneux would then go out and make various interviews, say, oh yes, you know, we promised this and that, and we didn't deliver, and that was terrible. Oh, silly me. I am such a vile human being, but next time, I'm gonna give you that and more. And so we would go around and round and round and round. And it worked for him for about, God help me, 10 years or something. And anyways, it has turned out to be a rather successful marketing strategy that a lot of video games has parroted. Paradox is next up. Vitoria 3, launching without proper warfare, was a fail, acknowledges Deputy CEO. And this is also talking, of course, a great deal about the paid DLC strategy. As, well, Paradox is often accused of selling early access games, and in this interview, they basically admit that they are not only selling early access games, but they're kind of sort of hoping that you'll just fix it for them as well. So let's have a read through it, shall we? I'll skip over this because this is just talking about how much goddamn DLC their various games has, which anyone who knows Paradox knows that already. One drawback of this approach is that Paradox may at least appear to be deliberately withholding features in order to sell expansions down the road. Appear. That's a very charitable interpretation. It's certainly a fair conclusion to make when said DLC expansions are later folded back into the base game, which implies that they should have been there to start with. Pretty much every Paradox game I know of has a vociferous group of players who accuse the company of releasing games that must be fixed with paid DLC. This is especially true of sequels, which inevitably look skinny and malnourished next to their much expanded and updated predecessor. At the company's media day last week, I asked Deputy CEO Matthias Lilja how exactly the company assigned resources between main game and DLC development, and how they address the perception of fixing with DLC, especially given their more recent experiments with subscription models, which arguably bake in the practice of holding material back. So, the DLC subscription model. I am of two minds of this. On the one hand, I'm actually quite a lot for it, for the simple reason that if you are a casual fan of grand strategy games, you're not really deeply sold with it, looking at a grand strategy game and seeing, oh, you know, $400 worth of DLC is going to be disheartening, and you are going to feel as if you are not getting the whole experience, because you're not getting the whole experience. And worse still, in games like Europa Universalis, the AI is going to get all of those features and use them vociferously against you. Yeah, it's not particularly fun. So being able to dip into the game and pay a subscription price, which is significantly lower than buying the DLC, and then dip back out again before a week is up, or a month or whatever, that's a pretty good deal. On the other hand, oh boy, you know exactly how the games industry works at this point. Getting a one-time $20 purchase is lovely. Getting a forever $10 purchase and a subscription package, ooh, that's a lot better, isn't it? Yes, it is. And there is every reason to assume that Paradox will be thinking that along those lines. Lilia began by making what struck me as a slightly unhelpful comparison with painting design. I think to illustrate that game development is a messy, open-ended process, I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do. To address that perception, he said, the reason that our business is sustainable is that we launch a game that is good enough, but like painting, when is painting done? When you stop painting it, I guess game development is quite a lot the same. Well, I don't know about that. And this will lead on to another thing, so we'll move on, because there is actually a justification here. More intelligibly, Lilia suggested that Paradox developers have a long and kind of unspoken agreement with dedicated players that they will build a business around DLC without taking the piss. That's the deal we have with our fans. We will continue to develop these games as long as you play it, and we can sell DLC. That's our sustainable business, and that's how we get these games that live for, in case of Europa Universalis, which is probably going to be replaced by 5 soon. It's about 10 years now. It's now called Early Access, but we did that earlier, and we didn't call it that. We developed as far as we thought we would make for a good game, and if we have the fans that want it, they will play it, and then we can continue to build on it. So this is the official then CEO from the horse's mouth admission that yes, Paradox games are early access games, and I find this to be a telling admission, because he didn't have to say this. He could simply say, we develop the games until a point where we think they are finished products in and of themselves, and then we iterate upon them thereafter. Instead, he specifically elects to call them early access, as in feature incomplete, and then if they are given enough money over time, they will then continue to actually finish the video game. And this is where the agreement sours, because yes, absolutely, Paradox has had a long-standing agreement with their players, simply saying that, okay, we are a grand strategy game company. They are not anymore. We are going to give you the grand strategy game you want. We are going to give you something artistic and interesting. We are even going to give you Vitoria 2, even if we think it won't sell, because that is the agreement between you and I. We will give you the full experience as long as we can, and when we have given that to you, we will expect you to continue to support us for a long period of time, so that we can continue to iterate upon that grand strategy game. This is the only way we can give you a game of the scope and scale that you desire. Fair enough. That was an entirely functional and understandable business practice that was embraced by the developers and the fans themselves for years and years. But again, Paradox has abused that trust again and again with games like Europa Universalis. Hell, look at Vitoria 2, for example, a game infinitely more complex than the vast majority of Paradox games these days. It was released and it got like 2 pieces of DLC. That was it. It was pretty much a complete product. But with Crusader Kings 2, that's when Paradox sort of began to realize that they could pretty much just, set their price and continue to produce an endless array of tiny iterative pieces of DLC that could then also be just sliced out of the original game. Imperator Rome was one of the few occasions where they didn't get away with this, because that was them saying, how close to the bone can we pare this? How much of the video game can we actually slice away before our players begin to notice? And Imperator Rome was the answer to that. That was too close to the bone, and it created a backlash. And he also kind of mentions this. Lilia thinks that expectations are higher today with regards to how much goes into the base game. A continuation of sentiments from earlier in the interview about how accepting players are that technical problems will be fixed after launch. But he still thinks Paradox are walking the line well enough. If you look at Crusader Kings 3, it was a really solid game at launch, and it now has DLC. But we also offer another subscription model so people can come in and at least try content without having to invest as heavily. And some stay in the subscription model, some convert to DLC when they've had a chance to feel around. So we try to find ways so people do not have to say yes all in or no never, but to find a middle ground. And that again is laudable, but here's the thing. No, players do not have expectations that are higher than they used to. We have pretty much the exact same expectations. If you look at Hearts of Iron 2 on launch, for example, it was a fairly solid product, and Hearts of Iron 4 does not improve that much over Hearts of Iron 2. In fact, in certain respects, I would argue that it is a downgrade, particularly in comparison to Hearts of Iron 3. The big addition from 4 was the addition of the construction system and the production of equipment, which was a lovely addition, but they also tore out the unfathomably useful notification system as well. They didn't give me this game, like they didn't give me Hearts of Iron 3 but plus 25%, they gave me Hearts of Iron 3 but 75%. That is the same problem with Crusader Kings 3 as well. Crusader Kings 3 was about 60-70% of Crusader Kings 2. And it didn't have to be that way. If you could develop up until that point, the additional iterative assets you would need to add in aren't actually that grand. The only things you would need to add to Hearts of Iron 4, to add up to the level of 3 is 1, a casualty system that actually functions rather than the half-assed one they added in later on, and 2, notification settings. If you add in those two, you've got 90% of the previous one. If you were to add in a way to actually customize air superiority sectors more than on giant F-off retarded regions, you'd have basically 3 but better. Instead, you seem to have deliberately stopped at about 75% and then added the rest in later, adding in naval combat later, adding in refined air combat later. Even such basic things as being able to intercept bombers instead of them simply teleporting to a target location was a feature added in years after launch. This is the issue. You are failing your end of the bargain. You are no longer providing the video games with the scope and scale at the baseline that we demand. And that is making it a hell of a lot more difficult to argue that we should be giving you more money for an inferior product. They also shared a little about how exactly Paradox First Party divide the resource between developing for the base game and of post-release expansions, including some thoughts on when and where the developers may have gotten the ratio wrong. We build games of all systems, it's a system of systems. That's mostly what our games are. Not all systems are created equal, so the question is, what systems are the core to this game? The experience of Hearts of Iron 4, what is the most important system to have fully fleshed out to make it a good game? That has to be there, but maybe we don't do everything because, again, we would never be done. Again, not correct. And that is exactly what goes. Hearts of Iron 4 got the basic system, and then they ignored air, they ignored weather, they ignored naval because they knew they could get you to pay for it later. When we fail, it looks something like Vitoria 3, he went on. People wanted more warfare, it existed in the game, but it was bare bones, beyond bare bones. You could go to war, but maybe that was not the focus, you had other things, diplomacy, economy, building your country, whatever, and people wanted the warfare. So there, maybe we missed it a bit. Maybe we should have focused on that because that was a part of the franchise that people wanted in the game. And there finally it is too. I remember when the Vitoria 3 leaks came out, Paradox was very aggressive. They even gave my channel a strike, I remember, over that, because I used some of the gameplay to show off. Like, okay, here's the gameplay that is leaked. You can see warfare is near non-existent. They didn't like that because they were trying to scam you. Do not even for a second believe otherwise. They knew the warfare system was shit. They are admitting it here. They were entirely aware of the fact that this was not what the fans wanted. They had been told over and over again, and the only response was like, oh, you'll totally like it when you see it. No, we didn't, because you knew we wouldn't. There is no if or when or maybe there. They knew it was a bad system, they released it anyway, and now that they are slowly beginning to admit that they're going to try to fix it, well, they already said that they were never going to change the warfare system in Vitoria 3. We'll see in a couple more pieces of DLC, and this will then be used as a PR move. They will do the Peter Molyneux things. In another year or two, they're going to announce, okay, we're going to give you warfare. And a lot of people are going to go, oh, thank you, Paradox, for finally listening to us, instead of going, it should have been in at the base game. fuck you, which is the only adequate response to that. And even now, they are beginning to add to the warfare system in the most minute, iterative ways imaginable, because they know it was a bad system. They knew that well before the game launched. What does this division of labor and resources translate to in hard numbers? I asked. How do Paradox allocate time between the launch game and post-release development? It's obviously quite a broad question. Different projects have different ins and outs, and Lilia didn't give me a very granular answer. But it does estimate that right now, Paradox Grand Strategy games might take around 5 years to make, versus around a year for a larger paid expansion. Considering the amount of stuff in these expansions, I don't know if I particularly believe that, unless you're talking about the system overall, like the entire company producing everything, because that would make sense. For the idea that it takes Paradox a year to produce something like the Naval Warfare update for Hearts of Iron 4, for example, sounds ludicrous, as modders have literally added in more complex system over the case of months, but hey. 5 years to make, depending on the length of the concept phase, which can be quite long as well. And then the DLC takes maybe a year, he said. So it could be 5-1 for the base game versus the first big DLC expansion. We can do smaller content, but it's very clear that people prefer the bigger DLCs. That's what people like. The smaller content pieces are maybe nice to have, but it's the bigger pieces. This also then indicates, okay, if it is a year for each piece of larger content, which again sounds unrealistic, frankly, let's call it 6 months instead, and it takes 5 years to develop, that would say that in your words, 5 pieces of DLC is an entire game's worth of development. To add in these iterative pieces. Nonsense, of course. But even then, if you look at the sheer quantity of DLC that Europa Universalis has, for example, you're basically stating that you've made something along the lines of, what, 4 more games over the course of that? The amount of content added to the base game does not seem to really lead up to that conclusion. You seem to be adding in a lot less each time, frankly. And this again leads me to think that you are trying to take out pieces to then be added in later. This entire idea of priorities. Now, priorities are important. Again, if you're making a grand strategy game, it's a huge undertaking. Maybe you can't pour as many resources into the naval warfare scene simply because it's going to be less important than land warfare. Fair enough. And then maybe add to that later could also be fair enough if the addition was actually significant enough to benefit it. But when you add something in that, like the aircraft designer or the ship designer, these are basic things that don't really add much to the gameplay because by and large, there's only going to be one correct answer. If you're going to want the best aircraft, you need this and this setup. There's not a whole lot of side grades there. If you want the best warship, you need this and this setup. Again, a limited amount of side grades. You have, in essence, failed yet again to provide the adequate complexity and depth to the system. In fact, you've gone the reverse way. Now, instead of having the Germans have the Panzer IV, for example, and the Americans having the Sherman, and having these two perform in different ways to different qualities, you have every single nation making the T-34-85, basically, but mechanically functional instead of the nightmare of electronic electrocutions, that's better, that plagued the T-34 hull, and the fact that the people making it didn't actually know how to produce the damn thing. And on the idea of fixing the game with DLC, arguing the Paradox have a decent track record of overhauling and adding to their games at no further cost. That's the negative way of looking at it, told. This game will live for a long time, and even if I don't buy anything, it's going to keep getting better, right? That's what we're after. And again, now on this point, I will defend them. They do tend to add to their games so long as you keep purchasing the DLC. Never forget, they promised they would fix Imperator Rome. They did not, because they realized it could not be salvaged in terms of sales, and so the product was quietly dropped after a few more updates. It's simply the way that Paradox operates now. Also, this one is a bit interesting. The unspoken concept, of course, that Paradox have been doing a lot of cost cutting over the past 2 years, closing studios, cancelling games, and laying people off. This seemingly has less to do with the publisher's tentpole, than with their outside bets on new genres, an XCOM-style turn-based tactics game and life sims, which they League of the Lamplighters failed, and their Life by You or something Sims clone also failed. But Paradox's grand strategy forever games haven't all escaped the guillotine. The publisher stopped supporting updates for Nimble Giant, unfortunately titled Star Trek Infinite, the year after launch. Paradox became a very big publisher and tried to get their hands in a lot of different pies, but here's the thing. Their brand of releasing a bare-bones product only really functions when you have the aforementioned unspoken agreement with your fans that you will be allowed the time to create a finished product, so long as you don't get crazy with it, and you have been getting crazy with it. With the expansions they had, they started providing lesser and lesser products. This in turn turned people off their products, unsurprisingly, whereas now, Paradox is realizing this. The reason why they're willing to say such things as, yes, we release early access games, and yes, we're basically fixing them via DLC now, is because they're attempting to regain the goodwill of the general public. They realize they have lost it, and now they need to debase themselves and go, yes, we did this, this was dumb, we're sorry, we're going to do better from now on, and they are cutting their costs, realizing that they didn't really have the chops, I guess, to make it in the other genres. And considering they've already basically resigned Bloodlines 2 to being a dead-end game with no support plans, yeah, that probably does seem like a pretty good idea, honestly, because if they pare back their studio's development size and they actually get back on track to making good games at a cost that they can actually support, we might finally begin to be seeing grand strategy games of the quality we were used to. And if they do that, there is no doubt that the audience will forgive them for their misgivings, because again, gamers are sadly far too forgiving a lot for our own good. If Paradox, however, continues down the line they've been laying out so far, well, Paradox is not Ubisoft. It took a very long time for Ubisoft to begin to crumble. It is not going to take anywhere near as long for Paradox. They've already had their one big strike, Vitoria 3. Bloodlines 2 will be strike numero dos. I don't think they'll survive a bad Europa universalis at this point, so as a fan of grand strategy, let's hope they muddle through, but this is the very least a good first step, recognizing that you have a problem. Now we just have to wait and see whether or not they can actually fix aforementioned problem. Do let me know what you think in the comments section down below, and until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.